Now that we looked at workstation virtualization, let's talk about data center virtualization, where we're much more concerned about performance and we're much more concerned about scalability and storage and so forth. So, as you can probably guess, for data center virtualization, we're most likely going to be using type 1 hypervisor as opposed to type 2 hypervisors, which we talked about previously. Um, so, data center virtualization products should be able to improve performance, help with management, reliability in the data center. So some benefits: reduced hardware and power costs. You can do server clustering much easily. You can do load balancing, improve fault tolerance. All of these things become a lot easier when you're in a virtual environment. Ability to create specialized servers to run different services. You can reduce server sprawl, which increases the cost of so server sprawl increases the cost of computer hardware and maintenance and power consumption. So let me just kind of summarize here what's happening or what happened in the past. Every time somebody needed some dedicated service in a data center for an organization, you would have to create a physical server, mount it in a rack. Even if it was just one you had to put a server in a rack. And the thing is, that server might not be utilized very often, right? Or it might be at different times and things like that. But you still had to have that powered on. You still had to have all that memory and all of the storage and so forth. It was very difficult to allocate storage when we didn't have virtualization technology. So if somebody asked for a server that only needed, say, 300 gigs of storage, you would always have to overshoot that and maybe use 500 gigs. Maybe it would never even get used. Probably 300 or 400 gigs was never used. So it's not very efficient. So virtualization basically allows us to run all of these machines in virtual environments that reduce the footprint. So it reduces the size of the data center, reduces the amount of energy that's being used by the data center. So there's lots of good reasons to do virtualization. And these are obviously lots of reasons that we're seeing virtualization so much more common today. It's funny that when virtualization first came out, a lot of IT people thought it was kind of a fad, like, geez, this is never going to take off. It's not enterprise ready and so forth and so on. And very slowly over the last decade or so, we saw virtualization become sort of ubiquitous. And today, I think it's really unusual to go into a data center that has dedicated hardware. Almost all data centers now are nearly all virtualized. I work with a lot of customers. I probably have about 1,000 customers I work with in 1,000 different data centers, and every one of them is virtualized today. So virtualization is not going anywhere, and that's why we have a course about it here. So in the old days, like I said, you would have all of these individual computers all connected directly to some kind of networking hub. But today, we take all of those computers and we virtualize those inside a host computer. Now, in the picture here, that host computer looks like a desktop, but in a data center virtualization, it's obviously not a desktop. It's going to be a powerful computer, probably a server class computer, and probably more than just one. They're probably going to be clustered and have multiple servers hosting these VMs. Although you don't have to. If we really only have 4 servers in our physical environment, that probably could be done with a single virtual server. But for redundancy, you would probably have 2 and so forth. But now we have that single network interface that goes to our networking hub. So as you can kind of guess here, the networking also is now virtualized within that host computer. And we're going to talk about that in one of the units later on in this course. We'll talk about how we do that, how we handle virtual networks. So data center virtualization, there's 2 primary products that you'll find for doing data center virtualization. Both of them are commercial products. One is VMware's vSphere product, and the other one is Microsoft Hyper-V, and you can see here some of the basic requirements. I should caution you that these requirements are probably based on older versions of the software by the time you're watching this video. As you know, in IT, things move pretty quick, so there are probably newer versions. But in the as is common, the Microsoft product requires much more disk and than its competitors. However, it requires much less RAM, which is interesting. It also does not require the same CPU as vSphere. As I mentioned before, whichever of these products you're choosing to use, you have to make sure that the hardware that you're going to use is supported on those environments. So it's very important to make sure that you have the hardware that's going to support these. So one of the things that we can also do with data center virtualization is not only virtualize servers, but we can also virtualize the desktop. And I'd say that this is not as common as server virtualization, but we are starting to see this in different organizations. It does make management a little bit easier. Um, so you have, in the old days, you had we use these terms thick clients and thin clients. So a thick client is a computer that runs its own operating system and applications. Um, and then a virtual desktop is a VM that is running a desktop operating system. Linked clones are virtual desktops that share a similar environment in order to save space. And then a thin client connects to the user's virtual desktop through a connection broker. So let me just kind of run through these real quick for you. Basically, in the old days, well, and for many organizations today, we have a thick client environment where every computer in the organization, every desktop, is an actual computer that has an operating system. It has all of the things you would normally expect to see in a computer, local storage, all of the things that all the applications might be installed on that machine. Um, a virtual desktop is basically a virtual machine that's running a desktop operating system. So it's a VM that's running a desktop OS. A linked clone are virtual desktops that share a similar environment in order to save disk space. So a linked clone is where you have essentially every time you need another instance of a VM, it's a linked clone and it shares many of the same resources. So it's not a complete virtual machine. It's only parts of that virtual machine that are cloned from a single master. And then we see the term thin client on this slide. In the old days, if you go back 20, 30 years in computing, it wasn't uncommon to have thin clients where you might have a mainframe or some kind of centralized server infrastructure. And when users were using computers, the computer that they were sitting in front of was a dumb terminal. It was basically just a screen, a keyboard, and that was it. And they didn't really have mice with those systems typically. But you would have a screen and a keyboard, and they would use something like RS-232 or Serial or even TCP/IP if they had that technology to connect back to that server, and it would simply reflect what was happening on the server on the screen. So when you hit a button on the keyboard, it was sent directly back to the server, and the information on the server was reflected on the screen. So there was no actual computation happening. There was no storage. Literally nothing was happening. It was just a keyboard and a mouse that was connecting to a server somewhere. I'm sorry, a keyboard and a monitor. When we talk about thin clients with virtualization, our thin client is basically a computer that is booting off of a network server, and your operating system and your desktop is one of these linked clones. It's a virtual desktop. So you're accessing a virtual desktop. Now, I should say that, in my opinion, those really aren't the same as the thin clients that we had 30 years ago. The technology is certainly a lot different. So it's a little confusing to me to use the term thin client. I wish there was a newer term that we use to describe those. But a thin client today is an actual computer. It's just booting off of the network. It may not need a local storage. But it's typically still it has a microprocessor and memory and so forth and so on, unlike the dumb terminals that we had back in the old days, which didn't need any of those things, or very minimally those things. So that's the environment that we see today. Here's a picture from one of the PDFs I uploaded into Blackboard. So it's just an image kind of showing you what this would look like when we do virtual desktop or when we do desktop virtualization. So there's different products that can do desktop virtualization. So VMware has a product, Microsoft has a product, Oracle has a product, and Citrix has a product. So there's a bunch of different vendors that support these. I don't know that all of these are still available today when you're watching the video. Some of these have gone defunct, and there may be additional ones. So certainly don't use this as a definitive list of what's available. If I had to guess, I'd say VMware will probably be in this business for a long time, as well as Microsoft. I'm not so sure about Oracle and Citrix. Those companies, may or may not still have a product offering, and there may be additional ones on the market at the time that you're watching the video. But these are some of the options that we have available to do virtual desktop. So we've learned about virtualizing the data center, but now we've also learned that we can virtualize all of the desktops in our environment as well, which has a lot of advantages when it comes to management of our environment. everything can be centralized.